Greetings, everyone. My name is Chris Chalenza, and I'm the James B. Knapp Dean of the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins University.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bill Egginton. I'm the director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, also of the Krieger School of Johns Hopkins.
Bill, I'm delighted to be working together with you and the Grass Humanities Institute on this new series on the ongoing crisis in the Middle East. It's got global significance, far-reaching implications, and it's something that is certainly still a part of our world.
I am too, Chris. This has been something we've been working on together for several months and really in conjunction with a very dedicated team of faculty who've been thinking deeply about the implications of the crisis in the Middle East and their roots, but also what it means for college campuses and for education and for communities of learning.
And in this dialogue and in the others in the series, I think what we'll see is something we value in an academic context, which is people bringing evidence and argument and reflecting different positions in the context of the same conversation.
I think that's exactly right. We began this series really at Hopkins with a series of with a panel discussion of Hopkins faculty representing radically different opinions about what was going on, and nevertheless managed to pull off a very large event where people were collegial, listening to each other, and this is what we're trying to do on an even larger scale right now.
That's right, Bill. Well, to close then, why don't we jointly thank the speakers, the moderators, and the viewers for contributing to this academic endeavor. And we hope that all of our viewers join the upcoming sessions and explore the complexities of this pressing issue.
I agree. Thank you, Chris.
Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sarah Wildman, and I'm pleased to be hosting and moderating the second of our five-part discussion series titled Conflict in the Middle East, Context and Ramifications. The series, sponsored by the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute at Johns Hopkins University, is exploring the long-standing tensions between Israelis and Palestinians, the political and social implications for both sides, and its broader regional and international impact. We hope to provide in-depth analysis of the ongoing conflict, focusing on historic roots, current dynamics, and hopefully identify pathways to peace. Tonight's discussion is titled Academic Freedom and the First Amendment. Here we'll be exploring the tensions between freedom of speech, academic freedom, and the challenges faced by academic institutions, faculty, and students in balancing open discourse with institutional values and external pressures. Joining us for this timely and important conversation are several notable names in academia, Michael Roth and Cass Sunstein, and my New York Times colleague, David French. And I will know a little bit about them all. Michael Roth became the 16th president of Wesleyan University, which is actually my alma mater, on July 1st, 2007, formerly president of California College of the Arts. Roth is known as a historian, curator, author, and public advocate for liberal education. Roth describes his scholarly interests as centered on, quote, how people make sense of the past. He is the author of 8 books, including Safe Enough Spaces, A Pragmatist's Approach to Inclusion, Free Speech, and Political Correctness. Cass Sunstein is currently the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard. He's the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. Professor Sunstein is a recipient of the Holberg Prize and the Distinguished Public Service Medal and has authored hundreds of articles and dozens of books. He's currently working on a variety of projects involving the regulatory state, sludge, defined to include paperwork and similar burdens, fake news, and freedom of speech. He's also author of the pocket-sized and extremely useful for this discussion book, Campus Free Speech. David French, my colleague, is an opinion columnist for the New York Times, writing about law, culture, religion, and armed conflict. A graduate of Harvard Law School and former major in the United States Army Reserve, David was previously a senior editor at The Dispatch and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He is a former constitutional litigator and past president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. David is a New York Times bestselling author. His most recent book is Divided We Fall: America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. Before we turn to tonight's discussion, I'd like to remind those of you tuning in live to submit questions using the form linked in our reminder email or by using the QR code displayed on the screen. We'll be monitoring the conversation and we'll do our best to respond to as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion of our broadcast at the end. I'd also like to thank the Hopkins and Home team for their production assistance and the Johns Hopkins Krieger School of Arts and Sciences and the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute for their tireless work putting the program together. If you're not familiar, AJHI aims to advance humanities scholarship and teaching at Johns Hopkins and promote literature, art, philosophy, history, and other cultural studies in Baltimore and the wider community. And now, without further ado, I'm actually going to start with my colleague David about a piece he wrote a little less than a year ago, and he and I actually had an online discussion about this at the time. But at the time he wrote, and this is when there were large protests on a number of American campuses oriented towards the war in Gaza. And David wrote, there's a profound confusion on campus right now around the distinctions among free speech, civil disobedience, and lawlessness. At the same time, some schools also seem confused about their fundamental academic mission. Does the university believe it should be neutral towards campus activism, protecting it as an exercise of the students' constitutional rights and academic freedoms, but not cooperating with student activists to advance shared goals? Or does it incorporate activism as part of the educational process itself, including by coordinating with the protesters and encouraging their activism? So I want to start with that because I do think this intersection, that paragraph, can really help us shape a lot of this conversation. And I'll turn to each of you with this, and then I hope we'll really open it up. But what is the difference between free speech and civil disobedience? Because I do think there's a little bit of a blurry line.
Yeah. So when I think about the difference between free speech, civil disobedience, and lawlessness, so free speech is protected by law. In other words, under the First Amendment, or if it's a private university and you have a robust academic freedom policy, the words that I say are affirmatively protected. If you try to interfere with my ability to say those words at a public university, you could face a First Amendment lawsuit and lose and pay attorney's fees, be subject to an injunction. Or at a private university, there might be processes at the university that I can appeal to protect my rights to speak. So free speech is pretty easy to define. It's the speech that I have a legally protected right to engage in. Civil disobedience is not the same thing. Civil disobedience is when you violate the traditional definition of civil disobedience. And the cardinal example of this, of course, is the civil rights movement. You violate an unjust law and you accept the consequences for violating the law. So this would be where Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of the bus, where people would refuse to move from lunch counters. In the height of Jim Crow, in theory, not in theory, in fact, they were violating local ordinances. They were violating local laws, and they were doing it on purpose to demonstrate the injustice. But then also they were complying with the consequence. They were accepting consequences. So classic civil disobedience depends on these two factors: an unjust law and accepting the consequences. Lawlessness, what we saw on some of the campuses, was that people were violating just laws and refusing to accept the consequences. So this would be, say, when an encampment breaks through reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, and you're not violating a just law. You're not violating an unjust law. You're violating a just law, and then refusing to accept the consequences for that. When that happens, you actually start to infringe on the rights of others, and schools begin to have legal obligations that will lock in to prevent that lawlessness. So that's why I talked about this, is because often we look at students who are violating the law and we say that's civil disobedience. No, it's not always civil disobedience. And I think the obligations of universities are to protect free speech, respect civil disobedience, and then protect the campus or the public from lawlessness.
Kaz, I want to pick up from there and ask you what framework you think that colleges and universities should use in regulating speech, or is there a framework at all?
That's great. So that could be an impossibly difficult question if we tried to build a framework from the ground up. or we could just take off the shelf the First Amendment to the US Constitution as it's been understood for the last, let's say, 60 years, when a lot of the details have been filled in. And the First Amendment fits broadly with what David said. So civil disobedience isn't protected by the First Amendment. That's easy. Lawlessness isn't protected by the First Amendment. Plagiarism isn't protected by the First Amendment. Conspiracy isn't protected by the First Amendment. Criminal conspiracy, at least. If it's a conspiracy to do something nice in ordinary language, that's okay. Bribery is not protected. And then we have something which across a wide domain is a set of rules. Now, public universities have to follow the First Amendment, and it's a really great foundation for what they need to do. Private universities just don't, because private universities aren't subject to the First Amendment. A lot of people find that surprising, but it's so. Still, for a university to say our foundation for what we're going to do is laid down by the First Amendment to the US Constitution, that's makes life a lot simpler. And for students and faculty and administrators, it also makes life a lot better and more fair.
I want to come back to that private-public divide, but I want to turn to Michael Roth first and ask him about this idea. Two things. I mean, one is you have a whole book called Safe Enough Spaces, but you also wrote going into this semester, the early part of last semester, rather, that you hoped your campus would actually be more political. How do you see those things in tension or play a part with this question of free speech on campus?
Well, that piece I wrote in the Times about hoping my students were more political was in part a response to the fear that many of my colleagues have felt at other campuses about student protests, with good reason in many places, and their efforts to make clearer than they had before what the time and place restrictions might be or what was permissible in a protest. And I was very concerned in the last year until the elections about trying to find ways to motivate students around the country to participate in the public sphere in greater numbers, working on campaigns locally, nationally, taking on issues that were being debated in the public sphere, to be political in this much broader sense than just protesting. And so I was hoping, as it turned out, the hopes were unfounded. I was hoping that there'd be a wave of student activism that would lead them to participate in the national elections, to be sure, but also in their states, because I do think that one of the ways that people acquire a liberal education is by engaging in the public sphere. That's not so much encouraging activism of a particular, it's not encouraging activism of a particular sort, but it is encouraging our students to practice democracy in some way, or practice being part of the public sphere as part of what they're learning at a university. So that's what I was getting at in that piece. I think that protesters, in most cases that I know about, in the spring were trying to call attention to something that was unjust in their view. And so I know many of them felt that they were breaking some rules, but they were doing so to call attention, to bring attention to an extraordinarily horrific situation in Gaza. And I think the analogy would be like, the people get arrested at the lunch counter, they weren't really there to have lunch. They were not, in other words, the rule they were breaking was at the lunch counter, but what they were trying to do, and they did successfully, is to call attention to a system of injustice. They were willing to have the consequences, but the point was not just to break a specific rule, but I think to call attention to a situation they found unbearable. And I think many of the students who were witnessing the United States support for the Israeli military action in Gaza thought that was unbearable, and they were trying to find ways to call attention to it.
I think that this gets into this question. Each of you have brought up this reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. Actually, I think we should define it for the audience. Anybody can do it, because I'm not sure that people understand what that means exactly.
Well,
So
it's the
this is
as the resident litigator who's litigated that question a bunch. The best way to think about it is there are rules that are content neutral. So this is very, very important. It cannot be that the rules are if you're pro-Palestinian, you get the quad for a day, and if you're pro-Israeli, you get the quad for 2 days. That would not be a content neutral regulation. So it would be a regulation that is content neutral, that applies to everybody regardless of the content or viewpoint of their speech. And the rule is there have to be reasonable content neutral regulations that can regulate, for example, the time when you speak. So, for example, if you're protesting the war at 3 in the afternoon on campus, it's very different from using amplification at 3 in the morning on campus where people are trying to sleep. So time is a big factor. Place, where do you do it? Is it going to be on a quad, which is a place that, say, is generally used for speech, or is it going to be right outside my dorm room door, which is a place that is reserved for quiet and for study and for sleep? And then the manner, how much amplification, what kind of conduct is permitted. So all of these are reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. When they're drawn up the right way, facilitate free speech. They don't inhibit it, because they create an environment where you get to take turns, where somebody has a speech for one period and then somebody else gets it for another period. Or they do it in such a way that the speech doesn't devolve into harassment. So, for example, shouting slogans at 3 in the afternoon in the quad. Again, if you're shouting that same slogan at 3 in the morning outside somebody's dorm room, that's much more like harassment. And so what reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions do is they allow everyone to speak, they prevent harassment, and they protect individual liberty. Because when you breach through them, for example, let's say you decide, I'm taking the quad. This is our quad for the next 6 days. Guess what? Nobody else gets that quad. And so what you've done is you've actually violated the rights of others. And so this is where I think a lot of the protesters went off the rails. They were breaking rules that were designed to raise awareness, but as they broke rules, they were violating other people's rights. And sometimes it even veered into outright harassment on the basis of ethnicity or religion, for example. But time, place, and manner restrictions are designed from the ground up to permit everyone the very equivalent rights to speak without interfering with the rights of other people.
Cass, I want to bring you in here because I know this is something you also teach, and I want to ask about that question of veering into harassment. Is harassment protected speech?
Well, it depends. If you say to someone, you voted for the wrong person and you don't know what you're talking about, or you're foolish, that's in all likelihood protected speech unless it becomes a threat. If a teacher says to a student, if you don't have dinner with me and there's a little romance, you're not going to get a good grade, that's unprotected speech. So there's no general category of harassment that's unprotected, but there are certain acts which could be direct threats or could be sexual harassment, which would be unprotected speech. And there's a theory behind that, which is it's far afield from what the First Amendment is about, and the harms caused by, let's say, threatening someone or saying date or bad grade, those harms are concrete and real, and they justify restriction.
But they are restrictions on speech. In other words, you can say, as David did, in the long run, it makes it easier to have free speech, which seems perfectly sensible. But they are restrictions on speech, and we have them for the ecosystem of speech. Although individuals' right to say something may be curtailed in certain situations.
There's another way to think of it. If you say to someone, if I see you here again, your face is going to get bloody. The reason that's regulable is not in the first instance that it protects the ecosystem of speech. It's that the thread is disconnected from anything the First Amendment is about, and that a fear of bodily harm, reasonable fear of bodily harm, is a very bad thing, even if that person has no interest in communicating ever. So too, if there's an act of sexual harassment, it's not fundamentally designed to protect the speech of the victim. It's designed to protect the autonomy of the victim from that kind of intrusion that sexual harassment amounts to.
Yes, can I ask you a question about this time, place, manner restrictions, or if someone feels, as Michael was discussing, that this is the cause of their generation, that this is essential to discuss, are they going to respect the idea of time, place, and manner restrictions? I mean, where is that line between sharing that space and allowing the next person to speak?
So building on what David said, this is going to be a little law, but it's fun, I think, as things go. So some restrictions are based on the viewpoint of what this person's saying. If you say you can't speak out favorably toward some nation, that's based on the viewpoint. The viewpoint is being targeted. And that's at the core of what the First Amendment forbids. There's also almost a per se rule of invalidation of viewpoint-based restrictions. Now, if you're with me, there are content-based restrictions that are viewpoint neutral. You can't discuss what's happening in the Middle East. The conflict is out of bounds. That restricts content, but it doesn't restrict viewpoint. It's not rooted in targeting viewpoint. But it's about content. Content, as David said, is disfavored. In a free country, the idea is you get to discuss topics. The government can't say you can't discuss topics. Now, if there's a restriction that says you can't, between the hours of 12 midnight and 4 a.m., be loud in the dormitory, that is content neutral. And it's fine because the justification, that is, you want to enable people to sleep, is, by all accounts, and I endorse this warmly, that is a very strong justification. Now, if you say you can't use campus for protest except between the hours of 3 p.m. and 3:05 p.m., or bracket protest, you can't speak on campus except between 3:05 p.m. and 3:10 p.m., that is time, place, and manner. But it's invalid because there isn't a good reason for restricting speech to 5 minutes only. So what we need to say is time, place, and manner restrictions aren't always going to be okay. It's just they're less invidious than viewpoint-based or content-based restrictions, which I think is a long-winded answer to your question. If a student says, I need to protest, then if the only available protests are in some 30-second segment between 5 p.m. and 1 p.m., then the student has a good First Amendment argument if the First Amendment applies. You can't limit speech in that way. But if it's more like you can't speak between the hours of midnight and 4 p.m., then there's a good solid justification. People need to sleep.
Michael,
And
oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, just to say one thing in response to your question, Sarah, which is an excellent question, and it's one I get from students a lot. And the answer that I give them is the intensity of your feelings does not trump anybody else's rights. And so you might think this something is the cause of this generation. You might think this is the most important thing, but the intensity of your feeling does not mean that I have fewer free speech rights, or that you get to harass somebody else, or that you get to block access to the educational opportunities of the school. And so that's where the legal obligations of the school lock in to protect other students from harassment, to protect other students' free speech rights. Because remember, again, if I'm occupying the quad, nobody else is able to speak on the quad. And so if I have decided on, because I want to respect these students' passion, that I'm going to selectively lift my time, place, and manner restriction for them, I'm going to have a cause of action if I'm a speaker who wants to speak on campus and I'm being blocked by speaking from other students and the school permitting other students to block my speech. So this is the kind of thing that I think is very important for people to realize if they're talking about the causes that matter the most to them. Yes, I can respect completely that a cause can matter, that you can think it's the great cause of your generation. That doesn't entitle you to violate any other student's rights at all. And the school is obligated to protect other students' rights. So by granting you permission to sort of live out your feelings, the school can run afoul of federal law all by itself.
But David, I guess your point would be, though, that if the authorities came in and arrested everybody and they had consequences, then they would be engaged in the great tradition of civil disobedience, because they would be accepting. In other words, they would be violate. As the guys who sat at the lunch counter, they're not allowed to be at the lunch counter people would say, you can't, we're going to take over this bus, you're going to get arrested, and you called attention to it, but it's civil disobedience. So if we're going to be content neutral about the kinds of protests, then we'd have to accept both as civil disobedience. Is that right?
Well, so civil disobedience is, my understanding of it is you're actually aiming at unjust laws. Now, if you want to violate a just law to raise attention, there's still the second part. You need to accept the consequences.
You have
And
to
by
accept
the
the
way,
consequences, right?
and by the
So,
way, the campus needs to impose them.
yeah,
Because if the campus
that's
doesn't
true.
impose them, the campus is violating the rights of other students.
For sure. So if there's a protest against an unjust war, or preventing students preventing military recruiters, let's say during the Vietnam War, or any number of those protests, they are infringing on the rights of others. That's part of the deal, and it's civil disobedience if they understand there are consequences to doing so. If I'm understanding the distinction right.
And let me jump in with one more question to add to that, which is, what if it requires, what if the protesters feel that that requires taking over a building, for example, or disrupting a classroom? How does that affect this place, time? What the restrictions on where one can protest? It would seem to me that if you're interrupting a class, then you are taking on the consequence of interrupting the class.
Yeah, we would
Or free
kick someone
speech.
out.
As a matter of free speech, that's super easy. So
Mhm.
that's good news, I guess, in a troubled world. So if you disrupt a class, that's not protected by the First Amendment. If you shout down a speaker, that's not protected by the First Amendment. Those are straightforward. Now, one might not like the First Amendment as it stands, but that's how things are.
I also think, for me, I'm the non-lawyer here in the panel, but it also protects the educational mission of the institution, and so as a private institution, I don't have the same First Amendment issues, but I have I hope, the same commitment to free speech, but my ultimate commitment is to the educational mission of the institution. And, there are times when people go on strike and don't go to class, and that's a moral decision, and they should have the consequences then, as David was saying. But when we've had, very rarely, but we have had people try to take their protest into a classroom, not about the Middle East most recently, and in those occasions, we discipline the student. And I think it's really because the educational mission of the institution requires that the classroom is a space for learning, discussion, disagreement, etc. And if someone takes it over, like they're taking over any space, like the quad or an office, I do think the consequences should be swift, actually, because these things usually get more complicated and worse the longer they go on, and the more violence you need then to restore order.
Michael, you raise a great point. If I can just say a few words around it. The educational mission of the university or the college, that's kind of central to thinking all these things through. And in the cases we're discussing, it's straightforward. If someone says, I'm going to protest a class and shut down the class, that disrupts the educational mission. Some of the hardest and most interesting cases are when the educational mission is invoked to justify content-based or viewpoint-based restrictions. So if someone says something that, let's say, is kind of hateful, but otherwise protected by the First Amendment, and let's say Berkeley or Michigan says, we can't have that here because our educational mission is compromised if it happens, and you can fill it in. It can be anti-Semitic speech. It can be, sexist speech. It can be just a lot of words that are obscene. The educational mission is both accurate as a justification for some kinds of restrictions, but potentially a nuclear bomb in the face of the First Amendment. So I would approach the argument outside of the context we're now talking about with fear and trembling, but with respect. So if a professor says at Berkeley, I can't really teach my math class because the planet's burning, so my course is going to be about climate change, the university can say, okay, math professor, you can't teach here anymore, not because we're unhappy with your views on climate change, but because you're a math teacher. That is content discrimination, but it's okay for the educational mission. But to extend that very broadly is to really compromise freedom.
So I actually do want to open this up a little bit more about the question of, can Islamophobic or anti-Semitic speech be protected speech? I'd like to go to David for that one.
100% yes.
Oh.
100% yes. If you're starting to, if you think about what is or is not protected speech, the category of unprotected speech constitutionally is really narrow. I mean, you're talking about true threats, for example. You're talking about incitement, where you're inciting imminent lawless action, and your words are likely to create imminent lawless action. You're talking about obscenity, child pornography, defamation, slander. These are just broad areas of unprotected speech. I mean, they're narrow, I'm sorry, narrow areas of unprotected speech, and protected speech is very broad. And it can include violence. It can include calls to overthrow the government. Can include blatantly racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic speech, as long as it doesn't rise to the level of actual actionable harassment, where there's a high bar for that. It's a high bar for there to be actual harassment, where your conduct has to be to such an extent that it's so severe and pervasive that it actually deprives you of the ability to receive the benefit of the educational program. So the reality is, you want to go with almost any of the hot button slogans, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, totally protected speech. Globalize the Intifada, totally protected speech. Somebody could say carpet bomb Gaza, totally protected speech. All of those things are examples of protected speech. And so that zone of protection is immense. The zone of restriction is small. And one thing I will say also about harassment, well, there's a couple of ways to think of the difference between speech and harassment. Free speech often, if you think about it as one to many speech, like I'm speaking to a large number of people, maybe I'm chanting globalize the Intifada to a large number of people, absolute free speech. If I follow a Jewish student from class to class with a bullhorn in their ear yelling globalize the Intifada, and I'm targeting a specific student because they're Jewish and engaging in conduct designed to annoy and to harass them, even though I might be using the same language that I used in chanting to a crowd, that can be harassment because of the solo targeting and the context in which that takes place. And these distinctions get really important because public universities both have a legal obligation to protect the First Amendment, and they have a federal statutory obligation to protect students from harassment. They can't check out of either obligation. And so that's what makes this at the edges tricky. 99 out of 100 of the disputes between free speech and harassment are actually pretty clear. The lines are clear. But 1 out of 100, it does get pretty tricky to determine the difference between free speech and harassment. So I have a few sort of shorthand ways to begin to parse those distinctions. And one of them is, once you start targeting a single human being on the basis of their ethnicity, on the basis of their sex, their religion, etc., that's when you are in that warning zone for harassment versus free speech.
There's a couple things that have come up for me with this, but I want to go to Michael for a moment and quote him to him. You wrote for the New Republic, homogeneity in the student body, not only in terms of racial or ethnic identity, but also in points of view, belief systems, aspirations, interests, and so on, undermines colleges' missions to help students develop personal autonomy. I think it goes back to your question of safe enough spaces, right? Which is this question of, what does it mean to develop an identity or a series of viewpoints? And how do you see this as connected to this free speech conversation?
Well, I think that free speech becomes truly meaningful, and I'm not speaking legally here, but just educationally, free speech becomes meaningful when you'll be able to hear lots of different voices. I mean, the reason in the United States, at least on our best days, in the United States, we're defenders of free speech is because we think through the exercise of free speech, we're more likely to learn things, and some people might say find the truth, or at least get along better, or be more productive, or any sorts of positive goods. And so I think that the diversity of viewpoint, of experience, adds so much if people can speak freely about their viewpoints and their experiences. And if you have free speech in an environment where everybody thinks the same thing, it's not a meaningful attribute. If freedom of speech is constrained by the population to whom you've given the freedom, and they're all of the same mind, then you're not going to learn anything. The current assault on DEI is to me so painful, because I think one of the things we've learned in the last several decades about how to have great conversations, or how to build great companies, or how to have interesting communities, is when people feel free enough to speak their minds, and that they have different points of view and different lived experiences. And at universities, we sometimes to celebrate the freedom to speak your mind, but we also have curated populations where people tend to speak, they think too much of the same thing. And so there's not enough intellectual or political diversity to make the ecosystem of speech as powerful as it might be.
I'm wondering, though, in this context, going to Cass, can government regulate or control speech on campuses? Can it ban, for example, critical race theory or woke teaching, or can it require patriotism?
Probably not. So the greatest sentence any Supreme Court justice ever wrote is Justice Robert Jackson, who wrote, "Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard." Let's try it from the rafters. And that idea was ventured, that sentence, in a case in which during World War II, the Supreme Court tried to require Pledge of Allegiance, and Jehovah's Witnesses said they didn't want to do that. And the Supreme Court said the government couldn't compel that. And note, that was kind of a compelling case for the government in a way. It's not college students, it's kids, high school students or younger. And also note that this is in the midst of war, and it's about patriotism in the kind of most fundamental sense. So if that case is good law, probably is, then to ban unpatriotic speech, to ban woke speech, to ban critical race theory, all of that is extremely questionable. And note that it's not just content based. David's correct category, it's also viewpoint based. And as Justice Scalia wrote in a great opinion a number of years ago, viewpoint based stuff is really, that strikes at the heart of what a First Amendment culture is for.
David, are these protections afforded to students who aren't citizens?
Yes. So the interesting thing about now, there are, yes, with some modifiers, that if you're an immigrant, if you're here on a visa, for example, and you're seeking to immigrate, get a green card, there are examples where, for example, you've been asked are you a communist, is part of, our immigration process, et cetera. But as a general matter, non-citizens and citizens alike both enjoy free speech rights, and you can see it textually. So the textual hook in the Constitution for applying the First Amendment to a public university is the 14th Amendment. And it's the due process clause of the 14th Amendment and I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but let me just give 90 seconds here. The original Bill of Rights only protected citizens against the federal government. So state and local governments were limited by their state constitutions, for example, but the First Amendment didn't, if you were living in antebellum Mississippi and you wanted to protest or object to slavery, Mississippi could punish you, and you couldn't appeal to the First Amendment because the First Amendment only protected you against the federal government. Well, after the Civil War and the passage of the Civil War amendments and the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court began incorporating the Bill of Rights to the states through the 14th Amendment, saying the 14th Amendment's due process clause, which applies to persons, not just to citizens, to persons, is the means for incorporating the First Amendment. And so that is why the First Amendment protects persons in the United States, persons, not just citizens. And that's a very important distinction, because had they incorporated the Bill of Rights through the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment, well, the Privileges and Immunities Clause applies to citizens, But the due process clause applies to persons. So yeah, if you're a non-citizen, you can absolutely file a First Amendment lawsuit in the United States of America and frequently win them. So it is not the case that only U.S. citizens enjoy free speech rights.
So a question has already come in, and we're not yet quite opening it up, but it's a question that I already had listed for myself, which is a question about when professors partake or take part in, professors or faculty take part in protest, either with students or externally. Can they be disciplined? Does the university have a right to tell a professor to withhold their opinion in one way or another? I'm going to go to Michael first.
So I can give you more of the experiential rather than the legal, and I hope I haven't broken any laws by my practice. But so last year in the spring, we had an encampment on Wesleyan, which is different from the kinds that we've talked about before, in the sense that it wasn't a takeover of a part of campus that for exclusive use, and there was freedom of movement throughout the period that they were protesting. And very carefully, the protesters, I think to their credit, I disagreed with their protest, but that's neither here nor there. But they respected time and place restrictions, but there were some faculty who, with enthusiasm of the righteous, wanted to either like teach a class in the encampment. We told them you can't do that. And then there were people who actually, as I understand it from some students, took a vote in their class, said, you want to go there, and then they put, of course, that pressure on the minority in the class who might not want to speak up. And so we said that you can't move a class into the encampment. But what I did was I spoke to the faculty at a faculty meeting, and I tried to appeal to their professional ethos, which was like they want to be good teachers. And if you think about it, you may say everybody in the class agrees that we should be waving the banner for whatever. But if you're a good teacher, you realize, well, not everybody may agree with me just because I'm the teacher. And you should be conscious of the fact that there may be people in the class. There are undoubtedly people in a class at Wesleyan who have different points of view, who may not want to express them in the face of the professor's passion. And so I appeal to their professional ethos, like the math teacher teaching about climate change. I say, come on, you got to teach the math. But if you're going to post about your politics, or you're going to go to a demonstration on the weekend, it's not my business. But I want the students to feel, and I think as all of my colleagues almost all of them, I hope, they want all of their students to feel they get the best education possible in that classroom, regardless of whether they support the professor's politics or some other form of politics. My students in my classes don't know my point of view. They just know that I think it's very important for them. This week, they're reading Darwin to understand Darwin's point of view, but they don't really know my point of view.
Cass, what are the legal implications of a professor protesting or asking a classroom to protest?
Okay, so let's take a private university, not bound by the First Amendment, can do whatever it wants, but let's hope that it will follow the First Amendment, at least broadly. If it's a public university or a private university or college that follows the First Amendment, there are serious protections that professors get. So if a professor says, I think climate change is the worst thing in the world, and I'm going to protest that in all my free time, so long as the professor, let's say it's a math professor, teaches math properly and does what a math teacher is supposed to do, that person is completely protected. If the person says, I like this political candidate and America's future depends on this person winning and the other one losing, that's completely protected by the First Amendment. So take that as very broad license for professors to exercise their freedom of expression. Where things get more challenging is, suppose a professor says something like, I think only men can do math. And let's suppose that's a math teacher. Consistent with what Michael's been saying, the university could say, look, you can't really teach math if you're telling a bunch of your students they can't do math. Or if a teacher says something, let's say, racist in a way that makes students of color feel that they aren't going to get a fair shot or that they're not being respected in the class. And there we have what is a content-based but viewpoint neutral foundation for restriction, which is the protection of the educational mission, requires some restrictions on what teachers can say, if and only if those things make it really hard for them to be able to do their jobs. And I see this, consistent with what David's saying, as a pretty narrow set of restrictions on what professors can do. And generally, if professors want to say, you know, I think that the only issue that really matters is occupational health, and we got too much of it, that's okay.
David, you know, we have all three, or all four rather, of us have thrown around a lot the differences between public and private universities. And I think we should actually unpack for a moment what that difference is
Yeah.
and why those are different in the face of the law.
Yeah. So a very short way of saying it is that public universities are arms of the state and are therefore bound by the Constitution, both the federal Constitution and the Constitution of the state that they live in. So if I am at a public university that is an arm of the state, then I have First Amendment rights, because the Bill of Rights, I have due process rights, I have Fifth Amendment rights, because the Bill of Rights and the Civil War amendments protect you from the state, from the government. Now, private universities, by contrast, think of them almost as people. Remember that Mitt Romney statement, corporations are people, my friend. If you're talking about the posture that a private university has towards the state, the private university possesses First Amendment rights. And the private university is not bound by the First Amendment. It exercises First Amendment rights. And so it can choose, for example, to be a religious school, whereas a public school cannot be religious. It can choose to create a free speech environment that's much more restrictive, where maybe it prohibits cursing, like a lot of religious schools do, or it prohibits other kinds of speech. That is the university or the school exerting its own academic freedom rights, its own liberties. And so private schools have much more freedom to orient themselves around a particular point of view and to enforce conformity with that point of view. Religious schools do this every day, for example. Now, the interesting twist, though, is that every public and private school that receives federal funds is bound by the Civil Rights Acts. So a private school is bound by Title VI. It is bound by Title IX. It is bound by Title VII. So they have federal legal obligations to protect their students from intimidation. So although they don't have their own, they don't have to protect the students' First Amendment rights, they do have to protect students from harassment and from discrimination. And I believe there might only be 2 or 3 schools in America that don't receive any federal funding at all and are not bound by Title VI or Title IX, for example, Hillsdale, Grove City. I believe there might be a Catholic college, maybe even Aquinas right down the street from me here in Nashville. But very few schools, very few, receive no federal funds. So the Christian college that I teach at, it's a religious school, but it receives federal funds, Pell Grants, GI Bills, grants, etc. It has to protect students from discrimination on the basis of, race, sex under Title IX, et cetera. So that's the general legal framework. Think of it. Public schools have to protect the constitutional rights of the citizens and uphold federal civil rights laws. Private schools do not have to protect the constitutional rights of their students, but do have to comply with civil rights laws.
Sarah, I think if I may, it just seemed to me at this moment that when I'm hearing this about schools having free speech rights, which is a very good thing to remember for me, that at the moment there's an unbelievable degree of fear in higher education for people to speak their minds. I mean, I'm teaching since the early 80s. I've never seen anything like this. I mean, and these are like good people, decent people, and many of them are kind of middle of the roaders, like I think of myself, and they're scared to speak up because the federal government, through the White House, has really announced a war on higher education and I think civil society generally. And the interesting twist for our purposes is they're saying on behalf of free speech, they're and have compulsory unification. And it's like we're still this all got planned because of the Middle East protests in the last spring. But right now, the federal government is supercharged at squashing dissent and academic freedom across the whole country in colleges and universities, and presidents, chancellors, deans, they're scared to death to actually say that out loud.
Cass, is that your experience at Harvard?
Not really, but I love the point. So, and maybe we should linger over it a bit. So, what we've been focusing on is people say things, and then a university, public or private, or a government punishes them. What we haven't explored, probably everyone who's listening, this will connect at some level to. Sometimes we shut up, not because we're afraid that we're going to go to jail or be fined, but we're afraid somebody's going to make trouble for us. It might be people in our community, or it might be maybe an investigation at the worst, but not really a threat of criminal punishment. The idea of self-silencing as a free speech problem, I think, is really important, though it's not technically a free speech problem. It's like political correctness writ very large in a culture of, let's say, left-leaning political correctness. And I've seen this at times in my academic career. Students who are right of center, they're not afraid of going to jail or being suspended, but they're afraid that people will look at them with extreme negativity. And that's a problem for a culture of free speech. It's why we want to ensure robust permission slips that involve freedom from looking askance or casting contempt on people.
I'm going to stay with you for one moment and ask something that you and I had discussed earlier, which was, what is the difference for an institution like West Point, for example, or the Naval Academy? Do these rules apply in the same way?
Yeah, remember Michael's point about the educational mission. That's really important, though with fear and trembling. West Point has an educational mission which is distinctive to it, that's shared by a few other military academies. For West Point to say, look, in order to be West Point for military preparedness, we have to impose restrictions that, let's say, the University of Michigan wouldn't impose. That's completely fair. It's creating soldiers, that institution. Now, that doesn't mean that it has free rein to say that you have to agree with this set of views or you're going to be discharged. But it does say that there are certain things, and you can take your pick. They can be, let's say, deeply unpatriotic things, and I want that to be a very extreme set of statements, which would be tolerable at the University of Wisconsin. But West Point could say that's not here. We're West Point. So to open up West Point or military academies generally to free speech diversity of the sort that is essential to even military institutions in a free country, that's really important. But to say that those institutions aren't as bound by free speech strictures as a public university that aren't military academies are, that's fair.
We have already been getting a number of questions, and I want to take this moment to get started with the Q&A, and I will also keep some of my questions in reserve. I want to encourage you watching live to continue to pose questions to Michael, Cass, David, and I using the form you can access via the link in your reminder emails or on the QR code that is now about to be on the screen. We will do our best to respond to as many questions as we can in the time we have left with us. So we did get a question a little bit ago about, in cases where student protests lead to disciplinary action, what due process rights do students have under the First Amendment? And I'm going to go to David just because Cass was just speaking.
Yeah, it's a good question. And as a general matter, it's not crystal clear what kind of due process rights that students enjoy in campus disciplinary proceedings. Now, there's a lot of case law in this, particularly in the Title IX context, where you have students being accused of, say, sexual assault, for example. And the cases are kind of all over the place as to what kind of pre-punishment hearing that you might be entitled to what extent are you entitled to cross-examine witnesses. Is not as cut and dry as you might think. And so the reality is I can't sit here and say specifically, here are the precise rights you enjoy if you are going to be expelled from campus or someone is seeking to expel you from campus. Now, if they're seeking to expel you from campus for a violation of, and you believe your First Amendment rights have been violated, you've got a tremendous source of due process in the federal courts. You can go to the federal courts and seek an injunction and seek relief from a court if your First Amendment rights are truly being violated. But if you don't have a larger constitutional issue, and the question is, there's no question the school is operating within its rights. Let's say, for example, like you're one of the students who broke through a door at Vanderbilt to occupied administration building and hurt a security guard as they were barging in. There's no First Amendment right to assault a security guard. You're going to have school discipline. And in that circumstance, the kind of process that you were guaranteed Vanderbilt, a private school, was defined by Vanderbilt, not by the government. Vanderbilt had the ability to define its own due process. So the basic reality is that it's very hard to say specifically what due process rights you have constitutionally vis-a-vis your university. However, in almost every case, your university has a student handbook that lays out some set of due process rights. So if you are thinking about engaging in protest and you are thinking about engaging in protest that may be a violation of school rules, I would invite you to read that handbook very, very, very carefully, because the courts are actually, by and large, going to defer to university processes unless it egregiously departs from anything that looks like real due process. But there's not a super cut and dried issue. So read your student handbook, read your faculty handbook, for example.
So this does get to the next question from one of our audience members. How should university administrators respond when student protests lead to disruptions like class cancellation or building occupations? And I can open this up to any one of you. It does not, from what we've been talking about, that sounds more like civil disobedience than First Amendment. So is it just university to university dependent? I mean, how do they make those decisions? I'll go to Cass because he looks like he's about to speak.
I was going to say, I think Michael's the expert on that.
Okay, so go to Michael.
There's no real prudence, yes. So prudence is our word for what the right punishment is, stipulating as we have the punishment is permissible.
Yeah, I think David's advice is really good advice. It should be pretty clear in your handbook, your faculty and student handbook. I'm at a small place, 3,000 some odd students. It's much easier. The protesters know me, I know them, the dean of students and the folks on his team, they can talk to the protesters about what's permissible and what's not permissible. And I think what's very important, and this goes back to what David said in the very beginning, is that when you say something is impermissible and people do it anyway, the consequences have to be rapid. And we do have what we think of, our own processes. We think they're, due process set of hearings that, as you might expect, there's a kind of graduated set of punishments depending on the severity of the infraction, and students know that. So if someone engages in violence, they will be kicked out. If they violate some rules between violence and complacency, there's a set of distinctions that are spelled out in advance. And I think what happened in many schools last year, either they just got caught unawares by the magnitude of disruption, or their processes weren't clear, or many of the people who were involved in the disruption were not actually subject to the university. They weren't members of the community. Wesleyan is, we're in Middletown, Connecticut, so we don't have a lot of people just passing through. And nonetheless, we did have disciplinary hearings. I wrote this piece in the spring, the New Republic gave it the title, "This President Won't Call the Police on His Students." Of course, in September, I called the police because the students basically said, "We know you're going to you say you're going to call the police, go ahead." And so I didn't want to do that, of course, because the police don't like to come for such small things. But I think it is really important to to make the lines clear. And I try to keep in mind that should be educational. It may not be educational for that person getting in trouble. It might be, it might not be, but it should be educational for everybody on campus. That it should be clear that this is an educational project. Protest can be part of that, but the disruption of the fundamental mission of education can't be part of it.
You know, I would really, just building on that, encourage people who want to deep dive into this subject to read two court opinions by the same judge. So the same judge decided motions to dismiss Title VI lawsuits brought by Jewish students, one against MIT and one against Harvard. And the judge allowed the case to proceed against Harvard, and it dismissed the case against MIT. What was the difference in the two? The difference in the two was the experience of Jewish students at MIT was pretty negative, but at every step of the way, when there was a disruption, the university attempted a response to it. It tried to create order. It tried to maintain order. So in this, as you tell the story, every action that was harassing was met by a university response. And so the court said, the real problem here wasn't the university's actions, that there were a lot of students who just had not imbibed the message of inclusion that the university had been hoping that they had heard. And so, but what was different about Harvard? Now again, these were preliminary rulings, so the facts will develop more as the Harvard case proceeds. But the court found something very different. He found that Harvard didn't always respond when there were disruptions. It did not always respond when there was harassment. And so that lack of response created potential liability for Harvard. And if there's one thing that I think is important to take away from this, if you're in a university administrator and there is a disruption, not responding to the disruption, allowing the disruption to continue, it might feel like the short-term better answer, because if you bring in the police, for example, things could get ugly. But over the long term, the reality is, in many ways, especially when disruptions are aimed at students as a result of ethnicity, for example, or sex or race, you don't have an option not to respond legally. And if you choose not to respond, you will face legal liability. And guess what? The students who engage in the misconduct can own individual legal liability as well. And so disruption has to be met with a response, or you begin to see legal jeopardy attached for the university.
Michael, you mentioned that you brought in the police, and actually at Columbia, of course, there are two major examples of this. One was during the Gaza protests of this last cycle, and then one was 1968. Do you have to invite in law enforcement? Are they allowed to come on campus?
Yeah, invite him. We're like any city, we can call the police, but we, our own campus security, they are not deputized, so they do not engage in physical interactions with students, and almost like 99% of the time, it's not an issue. I've seen them disarm people without, and it's all conversational. But sometimes, and this was the case with some students who wanted to take over a room, a small group, and we said, you can protest and you can say offensive things, of course, all the things we've been talking about, but you actually can't take over a room so no one else can go through it or what. That's just, and they knew that. I mean, I think we made that clear. They knew that, and they decided to do it. And so our own security are not able to just pick them up and move them out. And I'm not supposed to do that. I've gotten too old. So we called for some help, and it worked out okay in the end. I think that the students got the message. They didn't actually have to get arrested, and the police didn't take up too much of their time. But my students remind me that, I slept in the president's office when I was a student here at Wesleyan protesting, and they remind me of this. They actually celebrate it occasionally by coming to my office to protest. And I do think, there are consequences to that. I do feel like the consequences should be clear but not inflexible. I said to many students who said, "Why didn't you clear the encampment?" They are breaking some rules. Police do not chase down every person going over the speed limit. There has to be some measure of prudence and practicality, but also trying to keep things as clear as possible in intense situations. And in our case, I think partly because it's a small scale and people know each other, we were able to do that without violence.
So one of the questions from the audience, an alum watching, asks, how do First Amendment protections apply if outside groups, including political organizations, become involved in campus protest? And I'm not sure who to go with that. Maybe David.
Well, they're going to have universities, even public universities, are going to have greater latitude in dealing with outside groups, but they're going to have to be able to do it on a viewpoint neutral basis. In other words, they can't say, welcome Republicans, no Democrats, or, welcome PETA and no NRA, so there is a, there are rights on the part of even public universities to restrict access to parts of campus from members of the public. So, for example, members of the public don't necessarily have a right to just walk around classroom buildings, for example. But there are open spaces on campus that are traditionally public forums. In those circumstances, the school doesn't have a lot of discretion to really shut it down. So, the answer to that is you have more flexibility to prevent outside groups from working on campus. You just got to make sure it's done on a viewpoint neutral basis. You can't prefer one viewpoint to another in campus access, say, especially if you're talking about hot button political issues. But there is greater flexibility.
I want to pull another question from our audience. It's a student from the School of Education, who asks that this person feels that the issue is how people perceive or misperceive protections of the First Amendment, including activists, professors, even judges. I'm not sure if I fully understand that part of the question, which is why many universities, this person feels that the universities infringed upon rights of protesters this summer. How do you think universities can improve the training of university administrators so they understand what is and is not protected on campus? I guess I would add a corollary to that, and I'm going to go to Cass for that, which is, do administrators and protesters themselves need better understanding of what is and what is not protected?
Okay, definitely. So that's a great question. Really grateful for that. It turns out that 95% or so of free speech principles are really straightforward and clear, and you can write them down on maybe a page. So no plagiarism protected by the First Amendment, no criminal solicitation protected by the First Amendment, no true threats protected by the First Amendment. There's lots and lots and lots of other stuff that doesn't fall within the identified categories, and that makes life really simple to organize in a campus that's dedicated to the First Amendment. And I want to go up a little bit, maybe 10,000 feet, that not 10,000, but a few feet, that the principles that the First Amendment specifies, this is a phenomenal human achievement. And it's something our country should be like super proud of. And every student should feel, a little bit in awe of. And it wasn't created by one person. It wasn't created by 20 people. It was built up over the course of generations by people who are on the right, by people on the left, people on the center. And it's something that can be learned, and it's not a long time to learn. So to your question, Sarah, yes, university administrators who are completely amazing, but why should they be specialists in the First Amendment? I mean, maybe some are, but not generally, but they can be kind of fluent in the First Amendment, and it doesn't take very long. And the principles are kind of intuitive for students and teachers and administrators, as well as presidents. So there's a real opportunity here.
Do you think there was an opportunity lost then in the heat of various protests that we've seen?
I think there's an opportunity that started to be gained. So all over the country, we have people, they may be first-year students, or they may be deans of arts and sciences, or they may be university presidents, who they're not going to study Supreme Court opinions. But the basic principle, they don't have time for that. But the basic principles they are getting, and we've seen a surge of like free speech literacy on American campuses on the part of those like Michael who run campuses. And that's we haven't seen anything like that, I think, ever. And please may it hold.
But I just last week we got this dear colleague letter, and the last month we have messages from the White House that are going in exactly the opposite direction.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not worried about pro-Palestinian. I'm worried about the weaponization of anti-Semitism by Christian nationalists and to squash speech on campuses. I'm worried about people who are going to be denied hundreds of millions of dollars because they won't play ball about what to talk about, and they're not anti-woke enough for the current administration.
Well,
And I'm worried that schools, they're just not willing to sign on even to litigation because they're afraid of retribution from the government. So I don't know. I mean, we're talking about these bunch of kids some of them did stupid stuff in the spring. 90% of the protests were nonviolent and they didn't take over buildings. We get stuck on UCLA and Columbia and Chicago and maybe 5 or 6 other places, and I agree they were bad examples. But right now we have a government out of control trying to destroy free speech and academic freedom. And that worries me a lot more than the protesters who are still angry at me, but they don't have the force of the federal government behind them.
Okay, so let's bracket. If I'd like to bracket what's happening in Washington right now. There's a lot that can be said about that, but the inspiring thing is that universities themselves understand free speech principles a ton better than they did 3 years ago. And for people in your position, Michael, and like them, there's just literacy now. Now, at any time in American history, there's a risk that people in government won't get free speech principles. Maybe they're not incentivized to, maybe they're on the left, maybe on the right, maybe they're woke regulators, maybe they're anti-woke regulators. And the basic recipe for that is to make real free speech principles as applied to, let's say, California or Texas or Florida or Massachusetts or Washington, D.C. And that's always a work in progress. The most worrisome thing you said, which I've learned from, I thank you, but I also am a little mad that you taught me this, is that the universities are too scared even to challenge things that they believe to be First Amendment violations. That's concerning.
That makes me so angry that universities who possess enormous resources to contest illegal orders from a president are more frightened than angry. They are angry than frightened. And that is one thing that has been among the most discouraging things of the last month, was to see how many people and institutions, when faced with something that begins to drift away from sort of the normal range of political rhetoric and into outright authoritarianism, are just capitulating so quickly. Even people with immense resources, even institutions with immense resources, are capitulating so quickly to an unconstitutional, what is in many ways an attempted constitutional revolution in a power grab by the chief executive. And yeah, I'm with Professor Sunstein on this. It's infuriating when many of our nation's most wealthy and influential institutions capitulate.
Thank you, David, for that final answer. And unfortunately, that is our last answer. I want to thank Michael, Cass, and David for joining us out of your busy schedules and looking at these attacks on the First Amendment, how we support the First Amendment, how we understand the First Amendment, both on and off America's college campuses. I want to thank everyone at the Hopkins community who tuned in to listen to this conversation. Obviously, we could have gone on for another hour. And for more information about the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, you can visit a very long website, which I will not read off to you. To find free public virtual content, you can visit hopkinsathome.jhu.edu. And thank you again for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. And actually, I will just put a quick plug in to read all 3 of our panelists on this subject. Each of them have written extensively on this, far, far, far more than we could get to this evening. Thank you.